All right. It's good to be here. My name is Josh Swamidass. I'm a professor at Washington University in St. Louis, and I'm the author of the Genealogical Adam and Eve. And it's really my privilege here to be able to interview Alan Templeton, who's a professor here at Washington University along with me. He's a leading population geneticist. We call him the great Alan Templeton sometimes. That's what Nathan Lentz says, and that's also what I say. He's been at this much longer than me, and it's a real privilege to be able to talk to him about some of the things that he said in his review. He's a Jewish scientist and has been looking at the genetics of race for a really long time. I actually learned an immense amount about that from reading his work, and I'm looking forward to talking to him about that. So, Alan, thanks for being here. And as we kind of get into this, I wanted to start with one of the more peculiar things you put in your endorsement. You said that Jewish people have a blessing for everything, and that you gave me the blessing of a secular scientist and a religious scholar. What are those blessings, and what do they mean?
Okay, well, the blessing, in general, in Judaism, they emphasize the importance of blessings because it's a reminder to you of your connection to God. When you see something, you can realize just something you encounter every day is really, in one sense, a blessing. So they have many blessings for, like I say, just about anything you could possibly see, including if you see a secular scientist who has displayed much wisdom, somebody that you greatly admire. And the wisdom or the blessing for such a scientist is, "Blessed are you, Lord our God, Master of the universe, who has given wisdom to flesh and blood." But likewise, when you see a religious scholar who has shown great spirituality, great knowledge of the Bible and theology, you also can give a blessing. "Blessed are you, Lord our God, Master of the universe, who has given wisdom to those in awe of him." So both kinds of wisdom are valued in Judaism, and both need to be recognized as a blessing. And so that's something that you don't always see in these debates concerning religion and science.
Yeah, so what are those two blessings, actually? We looked them up, right?
Yeah.
No, there's a secular scientist is what?
There are books of blessings that you give when you hear thunder, when you see a rainbow, when you see a scholar, a religious scholar, or a secular scholar. So there literally are books in that. In traditional Judaism, you're supposed to say at least 100 blessings a day. So they want to cover a lot of things.
Yeah, so what is the blessing for the secular scientist?
Okay, well, I say the blessing for the secular scientist is, "Blessed are you, O Lord our God, Master of the universe, who has given wisdom to flesh and blood."
And then for the religious scholar?
Well, it starts out the same, but it ends in, "He was given wisdom to those in awe of him."
Yeah, well, that was very kind of you. So I like actually the meaning of it too. It says for the secular scientists, it's wisdom to flesh and blood, and even our atheist colleagues have that wisdom too, right?
Yeah. There's nothing about this blessing that says the secular scientist has to be a religious person as well. It's just that he has shown wisdom in this area of knowledge, and similarly for the religious scholar. So once again, both kinds of wisdom are important. Both kinds deserve a blessing.
Yeah, so this gets to like one of the other really important things that you put in your review. I think you were thinking about our secular colleagues who are wondering, there's this book about Adam and Eve. This has got to be a guy who's taking religion like a creationist and kind of cramming it into evolution. Of course, I'm getting accused of the other way around sometimes by young earth creationists of like taking science and putting it into scripture. That's not true either. I really did a lot of work to maintain like the mutual integrity of both those things. Not to keep it separate as in, irrelevant. I mean, I want to put them into dialogue with one another, but with integrity to their individual fields. And I think that's what you're trying to explain. Can you explain that a little bit more? And what would you say to the skeptical scientists listening in?
Yeah, sure. Well, as you've noticed in academia, there's usually two different ways of looking at science and religion. One is that they're antagonistic to each other. There's kind of a war of science with religion. And I've seen that an awful lot. There's even books called The History of the War of Science and Theology. Okay. And so that's one perception, that these are mutually antagonistic. Stephen Jay Gould, who was a very famous scientist from Harvard, paleontologist, argued a very different view, that there was religion and science are both important, but they're so different, there really is no dialogue between them. They're separate realms of knowledge, completely separate.
It's sometimes called non-overlapping magisteria, right? Or noma.
That was his phrase. Yes, that's exactly right. That was Gould's phrase. So, but there's really a third alternative. And it's actually shown by these two blessings, but it's also a very old theme in Judaism. Back in the 13th century, there was a very famous Jewish scholar known by Maimonides, who wrote a book called The Guide for the Perplexed. And Maimonides himself straddled both of these realms of wisdom. He was a physician, and in fact, he was a physician to the Sultan who lived in Egypt at the time. And he wrote medical textbooks and was a very famous physician. He also was an astronomer, not an astrologer. He made a big distinction between that. So he was a scientist and a physician. He was also the head of the religious community, the Jewish community that lived in Egypt at the time. And he wrote all sorts of theological books and is still regarded as one of the major theologians within Judaism. But this one book, The Guide to the Perplexed, dealt with an issue that already was evident to Maimonides back in the 13th century. And that is that there was this perception of science and religion as being in opposition to one another. And he wanted to write this book to show that's not the only way. They can, in fact, be in a partnership with one another. And this is a theme that continues. For example, Jonathan Sacks, who was the former chief rabbi of Great Britain, wrote a book called Science and Religion, The Great Partnership. Okay. So this is a theme that started literally millennia ago within Judaism and continues to the present. That is, that they can have a productive dialogue. And that's what I really liked about your book. It wasn't trying to put down the science or sugarcoat it, and it wasn't doing the same for the religion. Rather, it was saying, let's look at them both as valid ways of knowledge and see how we can have a constructive dialogue between the two. And that's a very important theme, and one that really resonates with me as well.
Yeah, well, thanks. I think also Adam and Eve is one of those places where people have seen pretty much conflict.
Oh, yes.
And to have a productive conversation over that, I think, was hard, and it was important. I think that's actually what makes it important, right? At least for me.
Yeah. No, it's really showing that a theme that has been almost a lightning rod for controversy between the two areas of science and religion. You can really look at that whole theme in Genesis 2 from a very different perspective. One that acknowledges the science and one that acknowledges the theology. And they're not necessarily incompatible. And in fact, they have something to offer to each.
Yeah, I think it's going to be interesting to see how it plays out from here. One of the most interesting views came out was from a theologian named Tom McCall. He kind of laid out the larger picture, and basically he points out that everyone's pretty much agreed that you got to give up on a traditional view of Adam and Eve if evolution's true. And so some people take that to say, okay, we're going to give up on those core Christian doctrines and accept evolution. Some people have said, okay, we're going to give up on those core doctrines and not be Christians. And then some people also have just, rejected evolution.
Right.
And I think this book really kind of comes into that and unsettles a lot of people's preconceptions and says, well, maybe these things actually aren't in conflict. And in that way, I think it ends up having an impact really across the spectrum, both on the people who are opposed to evolution and the people who have taken non-traditional views of Christianity and so forth. I mean, we can still keep our positions if we want to in the end, but we can't necessarily claim that as a reason anymore.
Yeah, there can still be incompatibilities or places where you just simply have disagreements. But these disagreements don't have to be phrased in such an antagonistic fashion. And you can always be looking for places where there is a partnership between the two. And that's what your book was about, basically, a partnership, not a conflict.
In a couple sentences before we kind of move on to talk about race and genetics a little bit, which I think is really interesting and important right now too. But before we get to that, in one or two sentences, how would you explain to one of our secular colleagues, like one of your friends in the population genetics department here at WashU or at a conference, why this is probably a book that they should probably pick up and read? Why would you tell them that that's something they should consider?
Okay. Well, first of all, there's almost kind of a preconception among many people that the book has something to do with religion. The science has got to be very poor. Okay. And that, once again, is part of these prejudices that exist, this idea of a conflict. And once again, your book is not. I mean, it uses very modern population genetic principles and uses them in a very correct, rigorous fashion. So it's a book that does good science. But you're right, it's also a book that deals with a very religious theme. But it shows, once again, that you can do good science and deal with it in the context of a religious theme. And you don't have to weaken or make or kind of somehow dilute the science. And unfortunately, there have been many books that have tried to reconcile science and religion that have taken that tact, I think, where they've either misused the science, or they've kind of portrayed it in a very weak way, or even a misleading way. But your book doesn't do that. Your book is very rigorous scientifically, and that's why I think it's important for other scientists to read that, to show that here's an example of doing rigorous science, but in a religious context.
Yeah, my hope is that if they see that, they'll want, even if they're atheists, like Nathan Less is a great example of that. You met him.
Yeah.
That they'll see there's actually work to be done here, both scientific questions that arise, that you don't have to be a Christian to be an empathetic scientist that wants to take those questions seriously.
Exactly.
And you don't have to be religious at all, but just because they're interesting questions that and that's part of what good science engagement is taking questions from the public seriously.
Right.
And so my hope is that they'll see that and realize that there's actually even a place for them in this conversation.
No, I think that's exactly right.
One of the key places where origins, the entry point for one community is really going to be about Adam and Eve, and how does that relate with modern science? But when you start looking at the history of it, the history of origins, and it's not just about the history of Adam and Eve, but it's also the history of how people thought about human evolution.
Right.
The looming thing that we almost never talk about in science, ironically, right, is race.
Yeah.
And this shared legacy of racism we have, really both on the theology side and on the scientific side. Yeah. Really no one comes out with clean hands. There are heroes in every place, but whatever place you gravitate towards, you should be a little bit concerned about that history. Now, the way that normally comes up is that we just talk about how the other people screwed it up in their history on race. So you'll hear like atheists talking about theological racism, which is certainly real and abhorrent. And then you'll see creationists talking about scientific racism, which is certainly real and abhorrent. And as I've learned about that history, one of the things that's most striking about it to me is that we don't actually learn this history in our scientific education.
No.
And I think that's a major problem. And as I learned about it over the last several years, that's one thing that I really do think that needs to change, honestly, in how we talk about these things, even like high school education, right, and how we talk about genetics and things like that there. But one of the really surprising things that happened to me as I was going through this, as I was looking through the literatures, I found out there's this name that kept on popping up, Alan Templeton. And I found out that one of the leading people in really reworking our understanding of this in the early 70s was a colleague of mine down the hall, right? And in fact, at the time, my office was it's still actually in 4444, the Genome Institute, where about 25% of the human genome is sequenced. And I had an office. I was at the time, and now I'm across the floor, but my office was literally like one office down from where your office was for a very long time, right? Yeah. And so we met and we talked, and that was a very meaningful conversation to me. I just wanted to just start out before we kind of dive into some of the scientific questions. If you could explain a little bit to people about how you got interested in these questions in the 70s. Because back at that time, a lot of the stuff that we're going to talk about race wasn't known.
Yeah.
In fact, most scientists would actually say that there are biologically distinct races, some of which may be more or less advanced. And some, might privately even, even though they might have liberal sensibilities to say we need to end segregation, they might say, but, honestly, if we're just going to be clear about it, some of us are farther advanced than others racially.
Yeah,
People would say that, right? And what's remarkable to me is that was just 50 years ago. It's not that long ago that was what's going on. So can you tell me kind of what your experience was being a young scientist at that time and what happened?
Well, actually, there was an incident that actually got me interested in this area. In 1976, I got a temporary job teaching at the University of Sao Paulo in Brazil. And this was a very exciting development for me, getting this. It was just a temporary position, but it was really going to be the first time I would actually be living and working in a foreign country. And so I took a Portuguese class for a year before I went so I could speak a little bit of Portuguese. And so I went there, just really enjoying the experience of a completely different culture. And Brazil in the 70s was even more different from the United States than today, because I keep going back. And so it was a very exciting time for me. And I'd been in Brazil about a couple of months in Sao Paulo, and they had a faculty party. And one of my faculty co-members in the Department of Genetics, Mario, came up to me and said, Alan, you've been living now in Brazil for a couple of months. Do you find it very different than the United States? So I started rattling off lots of differences. And then I made one difference that I noted to Mario, because Mario was a Black man and his wife, who was also in the department, was white. And I said, well, another difference is I've seen so many interracial marriages here in Brazil, many more than I've seen in the United States. And Mario looked at me and he said, really? I don't think there's many interracial marriages. And so here I'm talking to a man involved in an interracial marriage, and he says, they don't seem to be very common. And I said, well, like just in this department, there's several interracial marriages, because there were several men and women of what I consider different races, including Mario and his wife. And Mario looks around and he said, that's impossible, because everybody in this department is white. And I'm just sitting there stunned, and I didn't know what to say. And I'm thinking, was my Portuguese so poor that I either didn't understand what Mario said, or I said something that I didn't really intend to say? And so I was just speechless. And Mario then broke into a big smile and grin. And he says, Alan, I know why you're confused. He says, I did a postdoc in the United States. And when I went to the United States, everybody said, you're a Black man. But he says, look at me. It's so obvious I'm white. How can you North Americans see me as a Black man? And that moment, I just realized that my whole ability to define races and put people into the different pigeonholes was something I learned culturally. It wasn't something biological. It wasn't something that was necessarily real in a scientific sense. It was something I learned, but you learn it very early in your culture. So it seems so natural to you, you never question it.
Yeah, part of the strength of ideas of race too is that they build up a mythology of origins attached to it.
Exactly.
So it's not merely that we've categorized people. We believe that those are natural categories. They're intrinsic to biology and out there. That's just the world as we find it. However, that's an illusion, right?
So here was this man letting me know that his self-identity was white. And in fact, actually, when I looked into the genetics of Brazilian populations, there's much more mixture of African, European, and Native American blood in them, because they had a very different cultural definition of race. I'm not saying that there aren't races in Brazil. They do.
Because he still had a concept of Black, right? He would say...
Yeah, they do. But it doesn't coincide with ours. Actually, the last time I met Mario, I was attending the Brazilian Society of Genetics meetings in the state of Bahia in 2008. And Mario comes up to me, and Mario also remembers this incident at this party way back in '76. And he comes up to me and he says, Alan, you crazy North Americans are doing it again. You say you've nominated a black man for president. But both the Democrat and the Republican nominees are white guys. And of course, he was referring to Obama.
So when he talks about white versus black, is white like a socioeconomic status, or does it mean like someone who's black is African, like pure?
Yeah, it's a mixture of both. It's both socioeconomic and very extreme. So, you know, we kind of inherited the English definition, you know, 1 drop of blood of African blood and you're black. Like, look at Thomas Jefferson's children.
Yeah, but the irony is that we all got lots of drops of African blood.
Yeah,
right?
and that's it. I mean, now that we have the genetic resolution, we see admixture everywhere.
Yeah, so admixture is a scientific term that means of just like a churning and mixing of populations.
Yeah.
Now, so that's what your experience. How old were you when that happened? That was 1976.
Yeah, so I was still in my 20s then.
Wow, so like early or late 20s?
Late 20s. I was 29.
So that's like really early. And so what's interesting about it is you're a population geneticist. You have that experience, but you're also a scientist, right? You're not just like a 29-year-old hanging out, you know, in a study abroad. You're a scientist. And what's so remarkable, I think, about what you did is you took that experience, but then you actually really went and wanted to get the actual data to make sense of it.
Right.
Can you tell me about some of the early papers you did and what you learned and what the response was?
Yeah, well, I did it because I thought it was not only an interesting scientific problem, but I could also see it was a social problem, a political problem even. Because race as a cultural phenomenon is very real, and racism is associated with it, and it's a very strong force in many, many cultures. So did we really have a biological basis for this? Interestingly, there had been earlier attempts to do it. UNESCO actually had documents done by the scientists at the time, including like people like Theodosius Dobzhansky, a very famous population geneticist from the 30s, 40s, and 50s. And so I think in 51, they had a UNESCO statement basically saying the genetic data at that time did not support the idea of different races in humans. It really showed that humans have always been intermixing. And so in that sense, there really was a history, but you're right, there were other scientists who had very different ideas. And the data at that time was not so clear. So the real change occurred in terms of the quality of the data as we began to get more and more markers at the molecular level. And this really also was blossoming.
So one of those markers, if I remember right, was blood type, right?
Well, yeah, you have blood.
So people were wondering if that like blood type, like A, B, O, is that maybe segregated by race? You find out that maybe there's like higher ratios in particular populations, but it's actually spread everywhere. And so from a scientific point of view, then that means that you know that there's actually been a fair amount of mixing.
Right, yeah. Yeah, the data really indicated that, but you know, the low resolution at the time, it always left a lot of ambiguity.
Yeah.
People could interpret things in different ways. But as the 70s proceeded, the 80s, it became more and more, we could now look at many more things. And then of course, the whole genetic revolution occurred, where now we could really look at genetic variation directly at the molecular level and score it rapidly in many populations. And so the data really began pouring in. And so, although I had written a few papers on it earlier, I would say starting in the early 90s is when it really you could have data that could really definitively address some of these issues. And I tried to do it in a very strict hypothesis testing framework. You know, scientists have this kind of crazy backwards way of looking at the world. You don't prove things are true, you rather try to prove things are false. So you phrase—
Yeah, so a hypothesis is almost like a thought experiment where you say, well, suppose this is true.
Yes.
What would we expect to see? Do we find anything that conflicts with it?
Yeah.
And then, we'll at the same time, well, actually part of what any good scientist will do is we won't just say, suppose this is true, period. We'll say, okay, but let's also now suppose this other thing is true and this other thing, and have alternate hypotheses we're playing with, right?
And in fact, that's a theme you have in your book.
Mm-hmm.
You know, there's some things you can say, well, here's a hypothesis, we can falsify this one, but we can't falsify that. So there still is an open possibility.
Yeah, what I like about that approach, So some people would actually try and press towards, it means philosophers of science, some of them want to press more towards like an inference to best explanation point of view. But I do think that there's something that's missing with that. I think what's really good about the hypothesis testing approach, having that more dominant, is it starts to mark out the limits of evidence.
Exactly.
It turns out to clarify when there's several hypotheses that could be consistent with the evidence.
Mhm.
And there might be priors that we bring to the table or other information that discriminates those, but then we can say with confidence that this evidence doesn't actually discriminate.
Right. Yeah. And so that's what I was trying to do and have been doing consistently since then. And the case just keeps getting stronger as we get more and more data. And like I say, it really shows that humans have an evolutionary history of frequent movement of individuals and populations, interbreeding, and that our modern groups that we consider, that many cultures consider races, are really of very recent origin. And in fact, they're not in any sense, quote, a pure group in terms of their ancestors.
They're ephemeral, right?
Yeah, they're very ephemeral. In skin color also, I've done a lot of work on the evolution of skin color in humans. And so that's kind of the trait that everybody's using. Well, skin color basically is an adaptation to a high ultraviolet radiation environment. And so the skin color we have, like say in Europe today, which is a very low UV environment, that's only several thousand years old. It's from an evolutionary point of view, it's just something that happened just a while ago.
And it also happened multiple times, right?
Multiple times, yeah.
So you can get people that look the same on the outside, but that doesn't mean that they're actually the same.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, they are the same, to be clear. It doesn't mean that they were like together, separated off from everyone else to get that. I mean, it's different.
Yeah. And one of the things I point out, I've given lectures on this, both to scientific and non-scientific audiences. And one thing I do to show this difference is I do show there are some genetic differences between human populations. And actually the best predictor is really how far apart they are.
Geography.
Yeah, it's geography. And so I show them a picture of some Fijians and then of some sub-Saharan Africans. They're both on opposite sides of the world. So they're about the most diverse populations you can have within humanity.
What's different?
And I say, who are the Fijians and who are the sub-Saharan Africans? And people can't tell the difference because they're both living in high UV environments. And they both have the characteristics that people associate.
So is the tight curly hair part of that too?
They have the tight curly hair, the dark skin.
Is that like a pleiotropic effect or kind of like incidental, or is it more, is there actually something that UV protection?
Well, I'm not sure. I haven't really studied the genetics of the hair types, but I have of the skin color. And the best predictor of skin color is latitude.
Yeah.
Which is a proxy for ultraviolet radiation. And so dark skin evolves when you're in a high UV environment, light skin evolves when you're in a low UV environment. And that has happened repeatedly in human evolution, and it happens very rapidly. So skin color is not a good indicator of any kind of natural category. I've also done a lot of work in like diseases. I apply, and my PhD is actually in human genetics. And so I've done a lot of clinical things, and people say, well, you know, races are important because of these genetic diseases are not randomly distributed among the races. But that's very misleading. So for example, one of the textbook examples of a genetic disease is sickle cell anemia. And people say, here is a disease that's found in Africans. But it's also, turns out, it's found in people in Greece. It's found in Arabia. It's found in India. What's the common theme? It's found in all these different groups that are considered parts of different races by most people. The reason is it's really an adaptation to malaria, a particular form of malaria, falciparum malaria. And so you get much better predictability about whether a person is at risk for sickle cell, not knowing their quote race or skin color, but knowing do they have ancestry from
so
one
let's
of
press
these
into that though. If you look at Indians on one hand and Africans on the other, beta thalassemia is also an adaptation to malaria. You're going to see sickle cell anemia in both Africa and India. You'll see beta thalassemia in both India and Africa, but beta thalassemia is, beta thalassemia
Right.
is more common in
Yeah.
India
Yeah.
than sickle cell. So there
Yeah.
still is an association there, right?
Yeah. Interestingly, people have shown that there's kind of an incompatibility between adapting to malaria by sickle cell versus the thalassemias.
Oh,
So
really?
if you have a population that has the thalassemia got established first, it's actually a barrier to getting sickle cell into the population, vice versa.
Like a genetic interference type thing.
Kind of the border line. So in the one part of India, more the eastern part, you have much more thalassemia and no sickle cell. And it's only in the very western parts that you start seeing sickle cell.
Oh, that's interesting. So that actually explains, it kind of created like an equilibrium. And so that's not even evidence against interbreeding. It's really, there's like an equilibrium that actually enabled that to last a lot longer than maybe you might expect. So you can't actually drift to fixation.
Yeah, so there's actually been a lot of theory on this. There's alternative ways of adapting to the same environment. And sometimes these ways are mutually incompatible. So selection will work against.
All right, now we're definitely losing our non-scientific viewers, but this is super interesting. I'm going to have to read up on it.
Once again, it shows there are genetic differences between different geographic regions, but these differences are either local adaptations or they're really showing, once again, and they don't interfere with.
Well, I think there's really two things. They don't map to our conceptions of race. That's the first thing.
They don't map. So sickle cell doesn't map to any racial category,
and they don't map to degrees of humanness.
Right.
That, and you know, honestly, what we found, and I don't know if this was fully appreciated actually 50 years ago, but if you kind of get rid of things like segregation and you actually give people like all the opportunities of everyone else, we let them come to WashU instead of kicking them out and sending them somewhere else. You could take, you know, kids from the most remote hunter-gatherer communities and put them in a modern environment, and you know, you come back some decades later, you won't be able to tell them apart from everyone else because, and I don't actually know, because the world was so like fundamentally racist for so long, I don't actually know if people really realize that was the case, that so much of the differences that we do see are really because of different opportunities that people have been given that carry over from generation to generation.
Yeah. No, there's been a lot of cultural inheritance here that has reinforced these attitudes. That was the lesson I learned in Brazil, and it shook me up so much that I began to look at race in a totally different way than I had before.
And so as like I've been learning about this too, once again, this is stuff that I really do believe that we need to start including much more in science education, frankly.
Yes.
But as I was learning about it, I found out there still remains debates about whether or not races exist. And one of the counter arguments that people will give to you is to say that that race still exists because we can actually, you know, based on a person's genome, we can actually tell which race they're in. But I think what's going on there, and tell me if you agree with this, is that what's happening actually in that is a shift in definition of what race means.
Yeah. Because
back in 1976 or 1950 or 1960, when people were talking about race, they didn't mean what people mean now by that. For the people who are advocating scientifically for a notion of race, they're meaning it not to say that there's different levels of humanness, not to say that there's been long-term separation and distinct subspecies. They're rather saying that you know, that there is some real social construct and there is some biology that might be somewhat correlative with it. We can't entirely discard it. But I don't think that that's a real fair criticism, because it's really redefining what race is, right?
Well, what I point out is genetic differences is necessary but not sufficient to define a race. So because humans are globally spread and because most matings do occur between people that are born close together, we have this phenomenon that they're, like when a mutation occurs, it takes time for it to spread geographically. And that means that at any given point of time, you do have genetic differences just by the random forces of mutation and the time it takes for a mutation to spread. You will have genetic differences. And then overlaid on this, you do have local adaptation, like our skin color. Okay, so these do cause genetic differences between different geographic regions of the world. Now you're right, with genomics, I can actually identify every human as unique. Every individual is unique. I can identify all the people who are first-degree relatives. I can define the people who come from, our second, third degree relatives, and so forth and so on. So it's not a matter of being able to distinguish between different groups. Where do you draw the line? What do you mean by a race that makes it somehow a special group? So genetic differentiation is needed, but it's not sufficient to define a race. And interestingly, we do have definitions of race, and ironically, this was propelled very much so by the Endangered Species Act. Most population geneticists early on were just so upset with the concept of race and how it was being used in so many different ways, they just kind of gave up on it. But when the Endangered Species Act was passed in the United States,
then you can talk about like white rhinos versus black rhinos, and
you were supposed to protect not only species, but at least the vertebrates, and only vertebrates got this. You also had to protect subspecies, and subspecies corresponds to the kind of the scientific synonym for race.
So this is actually one of the most interesting things that I found out in your work. You have to tell me when this was discovered, because I don't know the literature exactly, but you point out that chimpanzees, this is deeply non-intuitive, right?
Mm-hmm.
By the genetic definition of race, chimpanzees have 4 or 5 races.
Yeah, they have 3 races.
3 races, and this is actually a really important thing for people to understand. Just think about the contrast here. Humans are across the entire globe. We're a cosmopolitan species. Chimpanzees are not that. They're in a very, very narrow little area in Africa. They're not across all of Africa. And in fact, there's one river that divides the chimpanzees from the bonobos. And bonobos are not chimpanzees. They're very different. And there's a river that divides the two.
They're different species, yes.
But so this is weird, actually, because actually it turns out that almost every species are like chimpanzees. When you look at in the world, that they're very localized, there's that type of really big shifts in species. So I think, if you look at the world through the lens of a naturalist in, the 1800s, then, it would make sense to think that that's what's going on with humans. But humans, that's not the case. We're all one race. But then what's going on with all these other animals like chimpanzees that they get races?
Well, this gets into some of the unique aspects of human evolution. We're really a very mobile species, far more mobile than most other species are.
And so that's not just the thing about modern transportation.
No, it's not just modern transportation. It's that we have cultural adaptations that allow us to live in virtually every ecological niche. So we can live in a wet tropical environment. We can live in a polar environment. Okay. And this has been true for thousands and thousands and thousands of years.
Yeah, and actually population genetics has shown, to many people's surprise, including, I would say it's just deeply non-intuitive. So, and even if you accept it as true, it's surprising that like over the last 10,000 years, the amount of admixture or movements of large populations is just shocking, to the point where, when we talk about, a native from a particular area, that is a complete misnomer, because the natives like 10,000 years ago were different than the people now.
Totally different, yes. Yeah. So the Europeans today really have a very shallow ancestry in that sense. Okay.
Yeah, ironically though, we all descend from everyone at that point, but that's another story. I'm talking about genetically at this point.
Yeah. So anyway, that was another thing that really influenced my work on human race, because although my PhD is in human genetics, I was always very interested in conservation genetics, and I've been involved in working with endangered species for years and so on. And one of the things was very dramatic was that you would look at almost all other species, they are much more subdivided. And in fact, you do have real categories that satisfy very rigorous genetic definitions of race or subspecies. And you don't have to go very far in the evolutionary framework. Chimpanzees are our sister species, and they show these deep divisions on a very.
So when did that happen? When did they figure that out?
Well, really, that's relatively recent work, because there hadn't been that much high resolution genetic work done. And
it's like 10 years ago, 20 years ago.
The last 10 to 20 years is when most of this work has been done.
Yeah.
And so, that also influenced me, like I've done a lot of work on collared lizards in the Ozarks. And these lizards show much more subdivision than humans do on a global level, just within the Ozarks. And so, so I was realizing that this concept of subspecies was not being applied uniformly. So the Endangered Species Act did help regularize it for people working in conservation biology. They wanted very strong, easily measurable definitions that they could use to meet the legal definitions of an endangered subspecies. And when you apply those same definitions to humans, it also comes out very clear. They don't have any of these subdivisions like that. So that was the other thing. So both my work in human genetics and my work in conservation genetics came together on this common subject of race. It also addresses an issue I know I've gotten. As you can imagine, having written about race a lot, I get lots of emails and phone calls and so on from all sorts of people. And one thing I've consistently got over the years was, well, your definition of race is so restrictive that it can never be applied to anything else. See it in humans because they can never satisfy. And I said, oh yeah, let's go to human sister species, chimps, 3 races, collar lizards, who knows how many.
Yeah, so this is like a classically, I mean, this is what a good scientist does, right? We work with controls. And so what you're showing is you're working with like a control. You're looking, okay, let's look at other species. And that actually kind of obviates his, or kind of ends his criticism.
Yeah. And so, that's the other thing I've tried to do is I've tried to put the humans genetic variation and our subpopulations and so on into the same context that I would apply I've worked with elephants, I've worked with lizards, I've worked with all sorts of organisms. And when you do that, you see that humans really they're not the only species that shows it. For example, many birds have huge amounts of gene flow because they also have very good dispersal mechanisms. Some fish do, like moray eels. Okay, they have the longest pelagic larvae. That is, they spend their time as a larvae longer than almost any other fish, and the ocean currents just distribute them. So when we look at the whole Indo-Pacific, 2/3 of the world, it's one population, like one random mating population. They even show less subdivision than humans. But there's only very few organisms that have these very strong dispersal mechanisms, and humans are one of them. And now with the ancient DNA and our ability to survey current DNA and project it into the past and the patterns that emerge, we have found that humans have always been moving around. And all of our evolutionary history is certainly since.
Yeah, this is actually, once again, like this is the stuff that surprised me. I mean, this is the stuff that I really think that, once again, I think should be taught more broadly because it's socially important.
Yes.
It is cutting edge important science. And I one of the things that was just really striking as I went through this, and I mean, I took my book to a lot of people, and I wanted to make sure I was putting forward good science. I don't want to say something stupid. I started actually writing this book before I had tenure. So, and actually some of the ideas came out before I had tenure too. So I was a bit, I don't want to throw away like a great scientific career by writing a pseudoscientific book, right? Anyways, what I found out is that there's a lot of really good science here that is well established, but most biologists don't even know about it. And
that's true.
And so we kind of come to the table with a lot of the same preconceptions, and I think that's a problem. I mean, this is one of those places where I think science can really speak to larger societal issues.
Right.
That's actually one thing that it deeply impacted me, frankly, as I was writing and thinking about these questions. We talked a lot about the science, but we could have just easily been talking a lot about how conceptions of Adam and Eve have really been misguided and caused people to use that to justify racism as well.
And it has, as you know.
Yeah, but we've been talking for a good amount of time here, about 45 minutes. I really enjoyed it.
Yes.
I think hopefully you'll be willing to come back and talk some more about some. Maybe we'll talk about Tasmania and the isolation over there. That could be really fun. How's that sound to you?
That sounds great. I would enjoy that very much.
So any final thoughts you want to say to everyone before we sign off?
Well, just the idea is, I think these kinds of conversations are important because, particularly like on race, there is, once again, that's an area where you could have a partnership between science and religion. It would be very powerful, and I think would hit a broader audience. Because I think, as you're right, the science isn't well known even among scientists. But when you couple it with the social and theological implications, that could help reach a much broader audience. And so I think there's another field that would be very fertile for such a collaboration.
Yeah, well, at the very least, we'll have another conversation for sure. This is one of the important parts of the grand questions. I mean, it really gets to that core question, right?
Yes.
Of what does it mean to be human?
Yeah.
So thanks a lot, Alan. It's great having you, and stay away from COVID, okay?
I'm trying. I'm stuck at home like the rest of the world right now.
All right, everyone. We'll talk to you later.
Okay, bye.